Daniel Ellsberg was one of the masterminds behind the buildup of the Vietnam War and believed in its premise. Later, he would learn U.S. presidents had lied about the war and leaked a 7,000-page top-secret document to the New York Times called the Pentagon Papers. It would end the war and lead to the resignation of President Richard Nixon. We discuss First Amendment rights and national security on Newsmakers. Daniel Ellsberg risked it all. His release of the Pentagon Papers exposed an era of U.S. presidents, 5 in all, misleading the public about U.S. intentions in Indochina. It would also lead to Watergate and the end of the Nixon administration. But should documents concerning national security issues be brought to public light? Joining me for that discussion is Vandana Magal. She's a professor of communication at Grand Valley State University. She teaches a course called News in Society. And Devin Schindler. He's an attorney and professor at Cooley Law School who specializes in constitutional law. I'd like to thank both of you for joining us. Well, let's jump right into this. PBS has produced a documentary. It's from the Point of View series. It's called The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. Let's roll a clip.
This weekend, portions of a highly classified Pentagon document came to light for all the world to see and brought cries of outrage from Washington.
The Pentagon Papers make it abundantly clear how little the public knew of what was going on behind the scenes during...
Its main effect is to refute the notion that we stumbled into the war.
At the White House, a spokesman said President Nixon got his first look at the secret report when a copy was delivered to him today.
This damn New York Times expose of the most highly classified documents of the war.
You mean that was leaked out of the Pentagon?
Sir, this is a devastating security breach of the greatest magnitude of anything I've ever seen.
Did we know this was coming out?
No, we did not, sir.
I'd just start right at the top and fire some people. I mean, whatever department it came out of, I'd fire the top guy.
The first issue they ran had a paragraph from Assistant Secretary of Defense to Secretary McNamara. I can almost tell it by memory. We're in Vietnam, 10% to help the South Vietnamese, 20% to hold back the Chinese, and 70% to save American face. Well, every woman in America that had a boyfriend or a husband, they could take it if we were defending the South Vietnamese, but to learn we're just trying to save face, that is a thing that angers you.
Monday was a very interesting day. I came back to the New York Times, hustled on the elevator, went up to the top executive floor. There was the biggest shouting argument I ever heard in my life. A telegram that had come from John Mitchell, Nixon's Attorney General. The telegram said, "We want you to stop publication immediately, and if you don't, we're going to take appropriate action." I mean, what in God's name have we been fighting for in this country for 200 or 300 years, to have the right to speak and the right to publish, the right to think against a threat by the government, if all we're going to do is give it all up because someone sends you a telegram?
Now listen here, printing top secret information. I don't care how they feel about the war, whether they're for it or against it. You can or should not do it. It's an attack on the integrity of government. And by God, I'm going to fight that son of a bitching paper. They don't know what's going to hit them now.
A federal court has ordered the New York Times to stop publication temporarily. The government asked for and got an injunction against the Times.
Before the Nixon administration enjoined the New York Times, there had never been another injunction brought against a media company in a federal court.
A name has now come out as the possible source of the Times Pentagon documents. It is that of Daniel Ellsberg, 40 years old, one-time Marine, later a top policy analyst for the Defense and State Departments during the Vietnam buildup.
Okay, so here we have this lone wolf, someone who has access to the Pentagon Papers, papers that were actually a study through the Rand Corporation. So there are a couple questions here, and that is it truly national security? But I think as you see the president's point of view and listening to those tapes from the White House, someone's being exposed here, and actually a line of presidents have been exposed here. You both study this. I know, Devin, you've actually written on this topic. Legally, what do you see here?
Well, anytime you get into this kind of situation, you have to ask yourself, how do we balance the public's need to know and the importance of the so-called fourth estate, the importance of the media? Our founders very much saw an important role for the media as a check on government. So on one hand, I have a very strong constitutional right, almost, freedom of the press, a constitutional value that we need to have a strong press, a press that is watchdogging and releasing this kind of information so we as voters can make intelligent decisions and know when our leaders are lying to us. On the other hand, of course, you've got issues of national security. By releasing these papers, the argument could be made that we put American lives at risks. Obviously, you can't talk about this without talking about the recent WikiLeaks. To what extent should we give the president the authority to make the decision when material should be released to the public in order to protect national security concerns? No easy answer here, and I think that's why the documentary is so interesting, because it shows this very difficult balance between the importance of protecting national security, the importance of protecting American soldiers and American lives on one hand, which strongly suggests that we have to have a very careful control over this kind of information. Simply put, information can kill, and if it is released at the wrong time or to the wrong people, it puts American interests at risks. On the other hand, as I said before, you have this countervailing principle under the First Amendment that the press must play an important role as a check on government. We cannot be intelligent decision makers in terms of how to vote, who to support, unless we know the truth.
And here we have a president shutting it down, essentially. I mean, the First Amendment rights don't matter. The president steps in. You teach this course. Your students have watched this documentary. What kind of discussions have you gotten into?
Right. So I would say this is about the historical government-press relationship in a democracy. And it's you know, we have there's a very interesting relationship between the press and the government. On the one hand, the government aids or fosters what we call the public interest through regulation. Another kind of another facet of that relationship is that the government needs the media, the administration needs the media to connect with the public, to get public opinion about policy and so on. And there's a very mutually cooperative relationship. But then there is one aspect of the government that is, or the state, to use a sociological term for the administration or the government. The state has one part of the state is outside of public scrutiny, and the National Security Agency is one of those parts, which they have a huge budget, but they don't have any public scrutiny, neither congressional scrutiny. So that the relationship between that part of the government and the press is not cooperative. Historically, it's been acrimonious. And I think this documentary speaks to that relationship between, say, the National Security Agency, part of the government, and the press. Traditionally, the press comes from the point of view that, you know, there should be free access to information and the public have the right to know. And the press acts as a surrogate for the public, whereas the public officials in that part of the government think that they have the right to decide what the public should know and what they should not know. And so, and that's why we have things like classified documents, right? With the imperative of national security, as Devin said, well, you know, if we let out this information, it's not good for national security, and so on. So there's that contentious, acrimonious relationship between the press and the government. And I think this documentary speaks to that particular issue.
Can I pick up on a point?
Sure, yeah.
It's a point well made. One of the issues that was raised in the documentary is essentially who gets to make the decision in terms of whether or not information should be released to the media. And the argument is made in the documentary and by members of the New York Times, among others, that essentially you can trust the press to make these kind of very difficult decisions. And at some level, I found that very troubling. The press doesn't have all of the information. The press doesn't know both sides of the story necessarily, because there's other information out there that is, you know, remains hidden from view, and rightfully so hidden from view. And the press has a very strong, and we can debate this obviously, but has a very strong incentive to release more because that's how they sell newspapers and how they get ratings. There's a built-in incentive to be the first one on the scene with the story, the first one to issue these kind of papers or to disseminate these kind of papers. And so one of the more troubling aspects, and I'd be interested in your views on this, but one of the more troubling aspects of this whole documentary and this whole debate is the position taken by some members of the press that, well, you can't trust the government. You can't trust the government to make wise decisions on whether or not information should be disseminated to the public. But boy, you can sure trust me, the press. I find that very troubling for the reasons that I've identified. The press doesn't have all the information. And why should I trust someone whose motive is essentially, at the end of the day, a profit motive to make these decisions, and not the people that are trained and that at some point I voted for to make those decisions?
That could be an argument in big picture. But this is, if you take this as a single case, here is somebody, though, who is studying a specific topic and who does know the facts.
Okay, but fair enough. The problem is, I have to say, I'm highly ambivalent about Daniel Ellsberg. On one hand, being a scholar of the First Amendment, being a strong supporter of the First Amendment, I applaud him for making this information and doing something that I think took a great deal of bravery. On the other hand, if I accord him that respect, aren't I essentially saying that any kook out there, and I'm not calling Daniel Ellsberg a kook, but anybody who comes to a decision in their own heart that we must issue this kind of information, I must disseminate these kind of secrets, well, at that point, I'm looking at chaos, and I'm looking at true risk to American lives. Now, not so much perhaps on the Pentagon Papers, because it was a historical view. But again, you can't get too far in this discussion without really falling into the WikiLeaks discussion. Some of that information that was released, in my mind, led to the death of people. Some of our informants, the information that was released. An individual made the decision that he was going to ignore his responsibility, I'm speaking to the soldier, his contractual responsibility, release all of this information over the views, the learned views of his superior officers, that releasing this information would result in the death of potentially American soldiers and certainly some of the informants. That individual made that decision. Do I want people like that making this decision, or would I rather, at some level, trust my government?
Well, Daniel Ellsberg was a whistleblower in the greatest tradition of whistleblowers, and I think investigative journalism depends on whistleblowers such as Daniel Ellsberg, and the press does not simply take that information and publish it, but has ways. At least that's what we want to believe, that they have ways of scrutinizing that information. We want the press to be skeptical. We want the press to scrutinize before they publish. In either way, scrutinize the information they have, and also scrutinize the government, scrutinize public officials, so that we don't want a press that is gullible, that is too cooperative, because that's a big check on our government. And I think in the tradition, although Daniel Ellsberg is not a journalist, but I think he's as I said, he's a whistleblower. And I think the New York Times took that information, and they worried about whether this should be published or not, and what is the consequence of publishing. They consulted many sort of their legal department and so on, and must have taken the risk of publishing it based on some decisions that they made, that this is an important document. The public should know what the study suggests. I think I think they acted in a responsible way. We're not saying whatever whatever comes their way, they should publish it. But of course there's another step to that. Right?
A document at that level, they were in a tough spot, because if they sat on it, and if that were somehow leaked, that they sat on this, then that would hurt their business as well. So they had a decision to make one way or the other, and they decided that they had to do that. And of course, as the story goes, once the president stepped in, then the papers went on to the to the Washington Post. The administration stepped in there, and then these documents moved on from newspaper to newspaper, and they began to get published across the country as the story goes, and that's how the story was released.
I'd like to make one. I'd like to sort of illuminate on that one incident they talk about in the film, in the documentary. Daniel Ellsberg lost his mother when he was very young in an accident. And it was a very telling kind of incident. He sort of relates that. He says, well, my father was an authority, is a person with authority, and I looked up to my father. And then he made a mistake. I think it was he fell asleep on the wheel, or he made a mistake. And so the point he was trying to make was, even when we totally trust our government, we've elected our government, public officials, but you cannot completely trust them. In the sense that there has to be some check. People make mistakes, and those mistakes then have to be caught at the right time. And I think who would do that if the press is so cooperative that we just take everything, as we don't scrutinize government information that comes from the government.
One thing that does come out in the documentary is that essentially you can make the argument that Daniel Ellsberg had the ultimate, the mother of all midlife crises. He had, for years, had worked within the administration and had respected authority. He really was one of the planners in many ways of the Vietnam War. And as a result of reaching a certain age and having certain relationships, his girlfriend was a peace activist, he turned 360 or 180 and really went completely the opposite direction, coming to the point that he felt that he was a co-conspirator in all of this. And so I don't want to play amateur psychologist here, but to what extent was Daniel Ellsberg's motives truly pure, or was he really purifying some of his own inner demons? We'll never know the answer to that question. But back to your point, just to summarize, the issue that I struggle with, and I have no good answer for this, at the end of the day, the press is making that decision, as opposed to the president who I vote for and elected. And in this scenario, of course, before going to the press, Ellsberg did something that I thought was much more responsible, frankly, is he took this material to members of Congress that had historically opposed the Vietnam War, and they did nothing with it. At that point, is it really Daniel Ellsberg's decision? He's presented this information to the elected officials, the people that we choose from both sides, I mean the Republicans and the Democrats, and they had made the determination, our elected officials, that they were going to continue in some cases to oppose the Vietnam War, but not use this secret information to do so. Daniel Ellsberg, again, very ambivalent, made a unilateral decision that he was going to be the one. Now, granted, the New York Times was there, but he was going to be the one to release all this information, whether or not it was, irrespective of what consequences it would cause. He thought it would result in the consequence of the war ending. In fact, it didn't, at least to the extent that he thought it would.
Is there language that administrations use? Is there language that presidents use, though, when selling wars, that you're not a patriot, that there are members of Congress, if you're in the minority, you're not a patriot, and that you don't stand up, even if you have the information in front of you? It's mentioned in the documentary. I think you can relate it to some of the more recent wars that we've been involved in. I'm currently reading the Bush memoir, and even Bush himself says, I didn't want it to be called the Patriot Act because I was fearful that the vote, it swayed votes that we had the Patriot Act put in place simply because of the name. Is there a lot of that patriotism that gets thrown into the mix when we decide to go along with the flow of things in Congress?
Well, I'm going to go back to that, the previous point, and then bring this idea of, what is patriotism? I do think that, and this is just my opinion, of course, that Ellsberg his motivation was patriotic in some ways. He was seeing the war as had a huge cost of human life, and when he realized, I think that from a Cold War supporter to his transition from a Cold War supporter to this person who leaked the Rand Corporation study, there was a motivation, yes, and the motivation was to stop the war. To stop the war because there was a huge human cost. I think he sort of saw the horrors of war, which the benefits were not very clear at all of the war, and but the horrors were humongous. And so I think he sort of joined all of these people who were opposing the war. And that was his motivation. So he had access to these papers and he brought those. He acted in some ways, I think, with personal responsibility, that was his responsibility to bring this information to the American people. I think that's how I see it. So the idea of patriotism, I think that, supporting the war itself is, I don't know if that itself is patriotism. I think scrutinizing what our government does and keeping our democracy and working to sort of protect the democratic traditions is also patriotism. And I think when journalists, routinely, reporters, especially in war reporting, they might have to think about what is their role here, whether to report the glories of war or how we are winning and what's to take sides with whichever side they are reporting from, or to actually to look at to scrutinize some of the sort of motivations of the war, what is actually going on, and bring some of that information back to the public, where we can think about this idea of this policy of war itself, whether it's working or not. I think that also is a journalist's role, and some journalists have acted responsibly and taken that upon themselves to do that. There is a very interesting, in I think the Bill Moyers Journal, there's an interesting documentary called "Buying the War," and I think in that Bill Moyers talks about this. Where does the journalist's responsibility lie? Just to sort of be a mouthpiece for the administration during war, or to look at some of the facts and see where we might be what might be problematic here.
There's a very thin line here between patriotism and in the sense of being active, and you can certainly be patriotic and oppose involvement in war. You can certainly be patriotic, and I think it is a matter of patriotism to be active, engaged, to read the media accounts, to learn about what our government's doing. I think that's the very definition of representative democracy. People need to be engaged, they need to be involved in making decisions. However, there's a thin line between that kind of engagement and the legitimate opposition to government action and giving aid and comfort to our enemies. For me, I would ask the question, and I have asked the question, is this information, is the reason I'm releasing this information truly to add more data points to sort of the marketplace of ideas, to oppose the war, to make my opposition clear and obvious? Or am I strengthening my enemies in the hopes that in the long term that will shorten the engagement, shorten the war? Because anytime you give aid and comfort to the enemy, you are arguably extending the war. You're causing more deaths to occur. Let's bring this down to a real live discussion. The WikiLeaks, very troubling to me, because now essentially the opposition, to the extent they're able to access all this information, it's on the internet, have sort of a blueprint of how we do things. Let's assume for a minute, I don't know this to be the case, but let's assume for a minute the soldiers that released all this had pure motives. I want to show what we're doing so we can end the war quicker. I oppose the war. Well, is that in reality what's going to happen? Or will it have the unintended consequences of lengthening the war? Because we can't just jump out of Afghanistan without essentially abandoning the folks that are supportive of democracy. But by giving sort of the other side my playbook, even if my motives are pure, ultimately I have harmed not only American interest, but Americans and arguably our allies serving in Afghanistan.
Well, I believe that the WikiLeaks is not just about bringing information that aids the enemy. I think we have also learned a whole lot of other things from WikiLeaks. What's going on in Egypt, for that matter, with the Mubarak supporters, how they're contending for power. All of that is coming out of WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks apparently has a partnership with many of the sort of media that we trust. The Guardian, the New York Times, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, they all have partnerships with WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks is a big source. I mean, I'm not advocating for WikiLeaks per se, but I think that's a huge source. Because I do think that they are acting in the tradition of the public has a right to know.
Well, but then Julian Assange is essentially making decisions on what is appropriate to release and what is not appropriate to release, as opposed to the experts that, at some level we vote for. I mean, doesn't that undermine democracy at some level when we have people I have no control? New York Times, I don't have to buy their newspaper. I have some level, we as a people have some level of control over what they do. But Julian Assange, I have no control over this individual. There's no check on him. And I find that very, very troubling.
Quickly, in 30 seconds, and then we have to wrap this up. How would you compare WikiLeaks to the Pentagon Papers?
It's very interesting because in some levels, WikiLeaks shows sort of the end of the Pentagon Papers era. When anybody can become a reporter and release this material, the Pentagon Papers, the lawsuit itself, the case itself, which we haven't talked about, takes on less importance because it's impossible for government to issue a prior restraint. They simply can't do it in the age of the internet and all of that.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up here. For the folks at home, we have a big event coming up, Grand Valley State University, the Pew Campus, May 26th, the Pentagon Papers, a film screening and panel discussion at the Loosemore Auditorium. Devin Schindler will be there on the panel, along with Gleaves Whitney, who's the executive director at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. We will also be Skyping in Daniel Ellsberg himself, and Peter Hoekstra will be there as well to talk about national security versus freedom of the press, and I will be there to moderate. I'd like to thank Devin Schindler for being here, and also Vandana Magal for being here to discuss the Pentagon Papers. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.